the time for our Muslim youth to step forward and start assuming responsibility to help guarantee your own future. This is what was done by generations before you. They were fearless, they were courageous. That was their time. Now is the time for Muslim youth to not be afraid.
Now is our time as American Muslims not to tell people what we are not about, but to show them what we are.
If they did not want Islam in America, then they shouldn't have brought over 25% of black slaves who were Muslim to America.
Islam was present in what became the United States of America before there was a United States of America.
We are rooted here in this country. Our bodies will be buried in this ground here. I have a vested interest in Islam in America.
It's time for us to write our history. Today, we, the Muslims in America, are reliving our opportunity.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. Assalamu alaikum. Now we have some very bright lights, so I can't really tell whether anyone is sitting out in the audience or not, because it didn't really sound like it when I gave you this greeting of paradise. I just heard a faint whisper, Brother Javed. So let me try it again, because I can't see the audience. So, Assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, very good. So I'm talking to a virtually full capacity auditorium here today. I want to thank the organizers of this convention for first allowing me to participate, but also selecting some very inspiring topics, as well as just the overall topic of the convention, this true quest for success. And I want to take just a few moments of your time to try to remind myself and remind you not so much about the specifics of the culture today that are bringing about fear, bringing about a type of reservation for many Muslims across this country to step forward to provide that leadership to this nation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will invest in us if we do as we are commanded to do. We all know the climate of hate and xenophobia, Islamophobia that has been created, that all of these things have been made so socially acceptable. The kinds of hatred and bigotry that we once thought had been swept under the proverbial carpet of this nation. But now they're all back open, and you and I, our children and our grandchildren, are being impacted and affected by these things. So I'm not going to emphasize these things. Let's go slowly through some historical pages of this nation, and then we'll come back to the present, inshallah. But when we start talking about the culture of fear, as specifically as it relates to the Muslims in this country, we need to go before the culture of fear and talk about a time when Muslims were coming from Al-Andalus and coming from West Africa in particular and coming to this land that became known as the United States of America. There's so many historical markers that we can point to and say that even from Muslim Spain, that there were Muslims traveling across the Atlantic Ocean and sailing back to Al-Andalus. That in 1312, a very large delegation of adventurous Muslims from the Muslim Empire of Mali in 1312 set sail across the Atlantic Ocean. And none of them returned.
but they left behind their artifacts, they left behind their imprint on the indigenous cultures of the Americas, what's now North, South, and Central America. Let's look at a time in talking about a culture of fear that really started in the Americas with the advent of the transatlantic slave trade. A slave trade that conservatively brought 12 million people, 12 million Africans into the United States. 1 out of every 3 of these Africans are believed, and now as evidence comes forward, probably an even higher percentage than just 30% or 1/3. But now it's seeming like even a higher number than 1 out of every 3 African brought to American shores was a Muslim. And then if we just pause for a moment, and believe me, I'm going to get to the future and the present. But if we just pause for a moment and talk about a culture of fear to practice Islam, there could be no greater culture of fear than a culture in which people were snatched and kidnapped from their lands, that they were stored like sardines in a can, even worse than sardines. The conservative, at least a half of the people who were kidnapped from their Muslim lands and brought here died in this so-called Middle Passage, that they got on the shores, that regardless of their faith, whether they were Muslim or not, the overwhelming majority of them were stripped of their religion, forced not to practice their religion. Some and many of them who were captured came over here as Muslim imams, as Muslim scholars. There could have been no greater climate of fear to practice Islam than during that period of this transatlantic slave trade. But yet, we have the historical record that so many of our brothers and sisters maintain their practice of Islam throughout this very wicked and genocidal page of American history. Don't have time. So I'm just going to give perhaps just one example. For those of you who live in Georgia, this has a very particular relevance to you. I live in North Carolina, but it has relevance to me because it's part of Muslim history. It's not just the history of Africans in America who are Muslims. It's all of our history. It's a part of our history. Claim it as we know it. There was a brother who came from the West African country of Guinea. Born in 1770 and 1802, he found himself in the Sepulveda Islands off of the coast of Georgia. He was fortunate to be on a plantation of a man named Thomas Spalding, who allowed for a little liberty. He only worked those enslaved on his plantation for 6 hours a day. He allowed the Muslims to practice their Islam. So from this plantation, the first known American Muslim scholar came forward with a document written in Arabic in the early 1800s, and people were baffled. They thought that, yeah, this man knows Arabic and he's writing a diary. It was not until 1931 when Georgia State Library took the time to commission people from Azhar in Egypt. Tell us what this document is. And they told him that this man who was enslaved on that plantation had written a Maliki book of fiqh, that this man was a true jurist of Islam. That's what could have happened, but it was not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qadr. That's what could have happened amongst those descendants and amongst those enslaved African Muslims, had it not, their Islam not been stripped to them, stripped away from them. Let us move a little further into history. You and I know that in the mid and late 1800s, waves of Muslims began to come into the United States, and as they came into the United States, there was certain resistance that was met, but for the most part, Muslims were not being targeted. In the late 1800s in this country, as other waves came into this country, Muslims were not being targeted. There was no climate of fear. In the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 1940s, take it all the way up until 2001. And stick a pin in 2001, and then you and I can historically and legitimately say that a climate of fear was created in this country for those who were Muslim and those identifying as Islam. And I submit for the purpose of this discussion that before that time, we imposed the climate of fear on ourselves. We were the ones who were afraid to come forward with our faith. We were the ones who felt that if we took a certain position, that we would lose the status that we might have in this country. No one seriously even knew that we existed as a Muslim people in this country for the most part until September the 11th in 2001. No one cared until after those events. So whatever hidden and undercover Islam that we were practicing up to that time was self-imposed for the most part. But here we are today. Here we are right now. We find ourselves with another tremendous tragedy that has befell not just the Muslim community, but we have the tragedy not of 9/11, but of 11/9. The day that number 45 was declared the president of these United States. I refuse to call this man by his name. I will only call him by a number until he gets out of this office. But just to tie some things together, I want to just extend for you a bit of history from more contemporary days in the United States that are very teachable moments for the Muslim community today. I want to just go back just a few decades and remind myself and remind you of a movement that shook up this nation and shook up and inspired the world, called the modern day civil rights movement, a movement that started. There are many markers, but for the purpose of this discussion, we'll say it started from 1953 and continued until 1967 as an identifiable movement called the Civil Rights Movement. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the name Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy living in Chicago, and like so many African Americans who had fled the discrimination and the terror imposed upon them in the South, the largest migration of people on the American continent came from Black Americans fleeing the terror of the South, going up into northern states, into northern urban cities, and throughout the Midwest. And so Emmett Till's family was from Mississippi. As a matter of fact, the family was living in a place called Money. Strange name, Brother Mahmoud, but Money, Mississippi. And so his family was living in Money, Mississippi, and Emmett had gone down the summer to spend with his uncle and his aunt. And he went into a corner store. And because of the rules of apartheid, the rules of separate and unequal, the rules of segregation that just menaced the South, when he went into this white-owned grocery store, there was a white female in there who claimed that he whistled at her. As a result of having this claim put on him, there was a rule throughout the South at that time called reckless eyeballing. Reckless eyeballing was when an African-American male looked at a white female with some lascivious looked like he ain't supposed to be looking at her. He should be lowering his eyes. He shouldn't be looking at this woman. So they were saying he was reckless eyeballing this lady, Mary Bailey. She testified, he whistled at me. What happened 2 days later? Members of the Klan go to his uncle's house at 2 o'clock in the morning, drag him out of his house. These were Christians doing the dragging, and it was a Christian coming from a Christian family, the person who was being dragged out at 2 a.m. in the morning. He was dragged out of his uncle's house. He was beaten so you couldn't recognize him. His face was just totally disfigured and distorted and mutilated. He was shot. A commercial fan was tied with a rope around his neck, and he was thrown into a river. When his body was retrieved and they brought him back to Chicago, and his mother looked in that funeral home at her son, she said, "No, in the name of God, we're going to have an open casket funeral, because we have to expose the unpleasant truth, the unpleasant reality that this nation is just living by. They're killing a 14-year-old boy, bashing his face in so you couldn't even recognize him. He looked hideous. He looked like a monster. But there was a black little small magazine at that time called Jet Magazine, and the photographer took the picture and he said, no other publication would publish it. But Jet Magazine said, no, we want the world to see what's going on in Mississippi. We want you to see. We want you to see these people with these flaming cross. See what they're doing in the name of Christianity. And Mamie, the mother of Emmett Till, was saying that, yes, we want the world to see exactly what's going on. There was a young lady, 42 years old at the time, by the name of Rosa Parks, a very good Christian woman. And Rosa Parks was asked by a long-term activist and a comedian by the name of Dick Gregory. She was asked by Dick Gregory, "Rosa, tell me, what inspired you to not refuse to give up your seat on that bus in Montgomery, Alabama, that many people say triggered the civil rights movement and brought Dr. Martin Luther King to the nation's attention because of the over year-long boycott that came as a result of this discrimination?" And Rosa Parks said, "You know what? To be quite honest with you, it wasn't that I was tired. It wasn't even that I was so outraged on that day, but it was the sight. I couldn't get that image of that 14-year-old boy, Emmett Till, out of my mind. And my Christian faith demanded of me that I do something. So this is why I did what I did. I don't have time because I've just been told I have 5 minutes. So I can't go through some of the things, and I apologize for that, some of the things that I wanted to talk about. But I want us to understand that the civil rights movement was primarily a Christian faith movement, a Christian-based movement, that the majority, those unknown people like Jimmy Lee Jackson, who in Selma, Alabama, was trying to defend his mother and his grandfather by being beaten in a peaceful demonstration, a voting rights demonstration in 1965. Jimmy Lee Jackson had taken his mother and his grandfather into a restaurant where they thought they were safe. And the police come in there and start beating his elderly mother and beating his grandfather. And Jimmy Lee just jumped and tried to protect his mother. And then he's shot and he's killed by the police. Jimmy Lee Jackson. And we should remember that name. He was one of those unknown heroes of the civil rights movement. He was shot and killed by the police, doing nothing other than trying to stop them from beating his mother. And he was a deacon in his church. And he said that, of course, before he was killed. But when people were asking Jimmy Lee, why are you involved? He said, it's my faith. It's my belief in God. I can't say that I'm following the example of Jesus and I'm sitting around and watching this systematic oppression and not do anything about it. So let me end on this particular note. And that note is that now is the time. Now is the time. Now is the time for us as Muslims to recognize that throughout the Quran, throughout the prophetic traditions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, is put into us as we hear it in our khutbahs, we hear it from our teachers. We know that the fear that we should have should only be of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not of other men, not of systems, not of tanks, not of guns. Or only legitimate fear that we as Muslims should have is the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now is the time. Now is the time for our Muslim youth to step forward and start assuming responsibility to help guarantee your own future. This is what was done by generations before you. This is what was done by the youth in the civil rights movement. Take the time and read the roles that they played. They were fearless. They were courageous. They were coming out of their Sunday school classes. That was their time. Now is the time for Muslim youth to not be afraid. Will I lose my scholarship? Will I not get a scholarship? Will I jeopardize this or jeopardize that? Now is the time for you to start taking control of your future. Now is the time for Muslim adults not to be afraid of losing that big digit job or those tremendous resources that you're getting from your businesses, that you're getting from your specialized trade. Now is the time for our Muslim adults to step forward and say that truly, I am not going to just tell my child, just feel all alone. I am going to demonstrate that I will make the sacrifices that it takes for this ummah to succeed and to live out its mission in America, now is the time for the Muslim elderly to share their experiences, to share their observations, to share the cumulative knowledge about social change in this environment that has been acquired from decades of struggle and decades of work. Brothers and sisters, now is the time for every segment of this Muslim community. Now is the time for our sisters. In the civil rights movement, if truth be told, the leaders that were held up to the world and to this nation as the true giants of the civil rights movement, alhamdulillah, not to take an iota from them, but women, the sisters, were the backbone of the civil rights movement. Read about this movement and you'll see. So now is the time for our sisters, for first our brothers, allow your daughters, allow your wives with the proper safety environment put in place, allow them to play a contributing role for this Muslim community fulfilling its mission. And it can't be based in fear. Keep in mind that we can't do anything to jeopardize the status that we have achieved, legal status that we have achieved and built over the last 50 years. Assalamu alaikum. Now is the time for our Muslim youth to step forward and start assuming responsibility to help guarantee your own future. This is what was done by generations before you. They were fearless, they were courageous. That was their time. Now is the time for Muslim youth to not be afraid.
Now is our time as American Muslims not to tell people what we are not about, but to show them what we are.
If they did not want Islam in America, then they shouldn't have brought over 25% of black slaves who were Muslim to America.
Islam was present in what became the United States of America before there was a United States of America.
We are rooted here in this country. Our bodies will be buried in this ground here. I have a vested interest in Islam in America.
It's time for us to write our history. Today, we, the Muslims in America, are reliving our opportunity.